He was born into Hollywood royalty, the son of the legendary Kirk Douglas. To the world, Michael Douglas had it all: fame, power, money, and a dream marriage to Catherine Zeta-Jones. But behind the red carpets and Oscar speeches was a man drowning in addiction, scandal, and heartbreak. And when he finally confessed, "I thought fame would save me, but it became my curse," the world saw the mask slip. From the moment Michael was born in 1944, the weight of legacy was already pressing down on him. His father, Kirk Douglas, wasn't just a movie star, he was one of Hollywood's most celebrated legends, a man who had fought his way out of poverty and carved his name into cinematic history with sheer grit and ferocity. For the world, being Kirk Douglas's son was a blessing. For Michael, it was both a crown and a chain. Growing up, every move he made was measured against his father's towering reputation. Kirk's sharp features and commanding presence filled not only the screen but also the Douglas household. Michael was reminded constantly by strangers, by family, friends, even by himself that greatness was expected, that anything less would be a failure. And yet, that same greatness often made him feel invisible. While Kirk reveled in the spotlight, Michael's childhood was marked by a sense of distance. His father was known for his intensity, but rarely for tenderness. Michael once admitted that he longed for approval, for a simple gesture of warmth, but Kirk was a man forged by hardship, not by softness. In that environment, love was often overshadowed by discipline, and admiration came with conditions. It was in those early years that Michael developed the complex relationship he would have with fame and family, a craving for recognition, but also a deep resentment of the shadow that swallowed him whole. The little boy who should have been allowed to dream freely was already rehearsing for a lifelong role, proving he was not just Kirk Douglas's son. As Michael grew older, the bond with his father became more complicated, shaped less by affection and more by expectation. Kirk Douglas was a man of iron discipline, someone who believed that life owed you nothing unless you fought for it. That philosophy, while it had carried Kirk from the son of impoverished immigrants to a Hollywood titan, created a chasm between him and his children. Michael remembered moments when his father's presence felt more like judgment than guidance. Kirk's success was legendary, and his standards were unforgiving. The young Michael often felt he wasn't truly seen for who he was, only for how he measured up. Praise was rare, criticism was sharp, and approval was a prize that seemed forever out of reach. This emotional distance bred both resilience and resentment. On one hand, Michael inherited his father's determination, learning early on to push himself harder than anyone else would. On the other, he carried wounds that never fully healed. He once admitted in an interview that while Kirk gave him strength, he also gave him a lifelong sense of inadequacy. The contrast between public perception and private reality was stark. Outsiders assumed Michael lived a charmed life, the golden boy of Hollywood royalty. But in truth, he was a child constantly wrestling with the impossible, how to honor his father's legacy without being crushed beneath it. The pressure carved into him a dual identity, part heir, part rebel, that would shape the choices of his career, his relationships, and even his battles with addiction decades later. In many ways, Michael's journey was already written in those early conflicts, a man determined to step out of the shadow, yet forever defined by it. By the time Michael Douglas reached his late teens and early 20s, the weight of expectation had become unbearable. Everyone around him assumed he would follow directly in his father's footsteps, slipping seamlessly into the Hollywood spotlight. But Michael, wary of being branded simply as Kirk's son, hesitated. He wanted to find his own way, even if it meant stumbling through the dark before the world noticed him. His early years in the industry were far from glamorous. Unlike his father, who seemed destined for stardom, Michael struggled to be taken seriously. Casting agents looked at him and saw only the echo of his father's face, the shadow of a name already carved in stone. It wasn't just about talent, it was about identity. How could he prove he was more than a legacy, more than a copy? Determined to forge his own path, Michael immersed himself in learning the craft from the inside out. He studied theater, worked behind the scenes, and gravitated toward roles that weren't guaranteed hits but gave him room to explore. Unlike Kirk, whose on-screen persona was dominated by ferocity and intensity, Michael leaned into a subtler magnetism, a quieter charisma. He wasn't trying to be a warrior like his father. He wanted to be something different, something that felt authentically his. But even as he made these early choices, the comparisons were relentless. Interviews often opened with questions about Kirk. Critics reviewed Michael's performances through the lens of his father's legacy. No matter how hard he worked, it seemed impossible to escape the Douglas name. And yet, deep inside, Michael knew the only way forward was to persist. The boy who had once felt invisible at home now burned with a desire to be seen on his own terms, even if it took years, even if it broke him along the way. This persistence would soon lead him to a project that didn't just set him apart, but changed the entire trajectory of his career. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The turning point for Michael Douglas didn't come from acting, but from a bold decision behind the camera. In the early 1972, Michael acquired the rights to Ken Kesey's celebrated novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a story about rebellion, control, and the human spirit. It was the kind of project most young producers would have been too intimidated to touch, but Michael saw something deeper. Perhaps subconsciously, it mirrored his own struggle against authority and the suffocating expectations that had shaped his life. At first, no one believed he could pull it off. He was young, untested, and still viewed as Kirk's son trying to play Hollywood. Studios were skeptical, doubting his ability to shepherd a project of that magnitude. But Michael refused to let go. He poured himself into the production, fought through endless negotiations, and pushed the film into existence against staggering odds. When the movie was finally released in 1975, it didn't just succeed, it exploded. Directed by Miloš Forman and powered by Jack Nicholson's unforgettable performance, Cuckoo's Nest swept the Academy Awards, winning all 5 major categories: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay. Michael Douglas, at only 31 years old, was suddenly holding the Oscar for Best Picture. That moment was more than just a career breakthrough. It was liberation. For the first time, Michael wasn't standing in his father's shadow. He was building his own legacy. The boy who once longed for acknowledgement had now delivered a cinematic triumph that Kirk himself had failed to achieve. For Michael, it was vindication, a thunderous declaration that he wasn't just the son of a legend, he was a force of his own. And yet, as much as this success marked a new chapter, it also set the stage for the intoxicating highs and devastating lows that would define his career in the decades to come. His next steps would take him in front of the camera, where he would transform into one of Hollywood's most magnetic and dangerous leading men. After proving himself as a producer with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Michael Douglas shifted his focus back to acting, determined to carve out a space where he was more than just the man behind the scenes. The mid-1982 became his proving ground, and in 1987, he found the role that would redefine him forever. Fatal Attraction wasn't just another thriller, it was a cultural earthquake. As Dan Gallagher, the seemingly successful lawyer whose life unravels after a one-night affair, Michael embodied a new kind of male protagonist, charming yet flawed, powerful yet vulnerable, and dangerously human. His chemistry with Glenn Close was electric, and the story tapped into the fears and anxieties of an entire generation: infidelity, obsession, and the fragile facade of the perfect family. Audiences were both captivated and disturbed. The film became a phenomenon, earning over $300 million worldwide, and sparking endless debates about morality and relationships. For Michael, it was more than a box office hit, it was the role that branded him with a specific on-screen identity. Suddenly, he wasn't just Kirk Douglas's son or the young producer with an Oscar. He was the man who could take audiences to the edge of their comfort zone and make them stare into the abyss of their own darkest impulses. Critics praised him for his ability to play men who looked like they had it all but were undone by their own flaws. This dangerous charisma became his signature, and Hollywood couldn't get enough. In an industry obsessed with safe leading men, Michael stood out precisely because he wasn't safe. He was magnetic, unpredictable, and even a little frightening. The success of Fatal Attraction marked the beginning of an era where Michael Douglas would dominate the late 82nd and early 92nd, not just as a star, but as an icon of morally complex masculinity. And his next role, just months later, would cement him as the face of greed, power, and ruthless ambition in one of the most defining films of the decade, Wall Street. If Fatal Attraction made Michael Douglas a star, Wall Street made him a legend. Released later in 1987, Oliver Stone's searing drama was a mirror held up to the decade of excess, greed, and corporate ambition that defined the 1982nd. At the center of it all was Michael, as Gordon Gekko, a ruthless financier who seduced audiences with charm and terrified them with his cold-blooded philosophy. The character of Gekko wasn't just another role, it was a cultural archetype. With slicked-back hair, tailored suits, and a predatory grin, Douglas turned him into the face of unrestrained capitalism. His now infamous mantra, "Greed, for lack of a better word, is good," became both a warning and a rallying cry, quoted endlessly in boardrooms, classrooms, and political debates. Douglas wasn't simply playing a part. He was channeling the spirit of an era intoxicated by wealth and blind to consequence. Critics were spellbound by his performance. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor, finally proving beyond any doubt that he could stand as an artist entirely separate from his father's shadow. For Michael, the Oscar wasn't just a trophy, it was validation, a declaration that his place in Hollywood history was secure on his own terms. But Wall Street also shaped his image in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Audiences began to associate him with men of power, corruption, and moral compromise. It was as if the line between Michael Douglas the actor and Gordon Gekko the character blurred in the public's imagination. This persona would follow him for decades, feeding into both his professional triumphs and his personal scandals. The triumph of Wall Street solidified Douglas's dominance in Hollywood. He had conquered both sides of the industry as a producer and as an actor. Yet success came at a cost. The intensity of playing such dark, complicated characters seeped into his off-screen life, and his next big move, Basic Instinct, would push those blurred lines even further, unleashing a storm of controversy that cemented his status as Hollywood's most dangerous leading man. By the early 1992nd, Michael Douglas had already proven he could command the box office and the respect of critics. But in 1992, he stepped into a film that would not only redefine his career, but also ignite one of the most controversial cultural firestorms in Hollywood history, Basic Instinct. Directed by Paul Verhoeven and co-starring Sharon Stone, the film was a neo-noir thriller laced with sex, violence, and psychological tension. Michael played Detective Nick Curran, a troubled cop entangled in a dangerously seductive relationship with a mysterious crime novelist. The role was tailor-made for the persona he had cultivated, magnetic, flawed, and irresistibly drawn to the darker sides of human desire. When Basic Instinct hit theaters, it became a global sensation. Sharon Stone's now iconic interrogation scene made headlines around the world, but Michael's performance anchored the chaos. His portrayal of a man consumed by lust, suspicion, and paranoia mirrored the reckless energy that audiences had come to expect from him. Once again, he wasn't playing the safe hero, he was embodying the dangerous everyman, the flawed figure audiences couldn't look away from. Yet with success came controversy. The explicit sexual content sparked protests, debates, and accusations of exploitation. Critics were divided, some praised the film's boldness, while others condemned it as gratuitous. Michael found himself at the center of this maelstrom. His personal image fused even more tightly with the scandalous, morally ambiguous characters he portrayed. For many, he wasn't just acting in these roles, he was living them. The film grossed over $350 million worldwide, cementing itself as one of the most talked-about movies of the decade. But the fallout was complex. Michael had become a symbol of both Hollywood's daring and its decadence. Admired and criticized in equal measure, the line between his real life and his roles grew thinner, and soon the pressures of this blurred identity would catch up with him. Because away from the screen, Douglas was quietly fighting battles that no amount of box office glory could conceal. Battles with addiction, obsession, and the self-destructive impulses that threatened to unravel everything he had built. By the mid-1992nd, Michael Douglas was riding the crest of fame. To the outside world, he seemed unstoppable Oscar winner, box office draw, Hollywood royalty. But behind the headlines, his life was spiraling in ways that mirrored the dangerous men he so often portrayed. Michael had long struggled with alcohol, but it was his startling admission of sex addiction that shattered the carefully curated image of a leading man. In a world where celebrities were expected to keep their demons hidden, Douglas's honesty was almost unheard of. He checked himself into rehab, acknowledging that his compulsions were not glamorous but destructive, pulling apart relationships and threatening the very stability he had fought so hard to achieve. The confession ignited a media storm. Tabloids feasted on the story, painting lurid portraits of Hollywood excess. For some, it was proof that the man who had played characters consumed by lust and obsession was not just acting, he was living out those same flaws off-screen. For Michael, however, it was less about spectacle and more about survival. Admitting the truth was the only way forward. Alcohol and sex weren't just personal vices. They were escape routes from the crushing weight of expectation, the emptiness that fame could not fill. Michael later reflected that addiction was his way of numbing the constant comparisons, the pressure to succeed, and the gnawing sense that he would never outrun the Douglas name. His time in treatment marked a painful reckoning, but it also revealed something essential about him: a willingness to confront his demons publicly, even if it meant humiliation. Yet, even as he attempted to reclaim control, life was preparing to deal him an even more brutal hand, one that no amount of power, wealth, or celebrity could shield him from. Because the next battle wasn't with temptation or reputation, it was with death itself. In 2010, Michael Douglas stunned the world when he announced he had been diagnosed with stage 4 throat cancer. For fans, it seemed unthinkable. The charismatic star of Wall Street and Basic Instinct, a man who had embodied power and vitality for decades, suddenly confronting a disease that threatened to silence him forever. The diagnosis was grim. Doctors told him the tumor at the base of his tongue was large and aggressive, and the treatment would be brutal. Michael faced months of chemotherapy and radiation, therapies so intense that he later described them as feeling like hell. He dropped over 30 pounds, his once commanding voice reduced to a strained whisper. On the red carpets, where he had always stood tall and confident, he now appeared gaunt, fragile, and haunted by the possibility that his time was running out. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Headlines around the world chronicled his fight, while fans and fellow actors sent messages of support. Catherine Zeta-Jones stood by him, though privately she admitted the toll was crushing. Their children watched their father transform before their eyes, struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the weakened figure clinging to survival. But Michael's battle wasn't just physical, it was emotional and spiritual. For years he had lived recklessly, daring life to catch up with him. Now, life had. He confessed that facing cancer forced him to confront his mortality in a way fame never could. "When you look death in the face," he said, "you start stripping away everything that doesn't matter." And then came the controversy. When asked about the cause of his cancer, Michael revealed it was linked to HPV, a sexually transmitted virus. The statement shocked the public, instantly fueling sensational headlines that overshadowed the seriousness of his illness. Critics accused him of deflecting blame, while tabloids exploited the revelation mercilessly. Instead of compassion, he found himself once again entangled in scandal even at the brink of death. Yet, against all odds, Michael endured. After months of grueling treatment, he was declared cancer-free in 2011. The victory was hard-won, but it left scars on his body, his marriage, and his already complicated public image. He had survived the disease, but the world would never see him the same way again. Michael Douglas's battle with throat cancer should have been remembered as a story of survival, resilience, and hope. But in 2013, during an interview with a British newspaper, he made a revelation that set off a firestorm. When asked about the cause of his cancer, Michael said bluntly that it had been caused by the human papillomavirus, or HPV, transmitted through oral sex. The world stopped and gasped. Overnight, headlines around the globe sensationalized the confession. Instead of focusing on his recovery, the press zeroed in on the scandalous detail. Tabloids screamed that Michael Douglas was blaming his cancer on sex. Late-night comedians turned it into punchlines. Suddenly, one of Hollywood's most respected actors was reduced to a meme, his private health crisis twisted into public spectacle. The backlash was swift. Critics accused him of irresponsibility for making such a statement, while others speculated about what it implied for his marriage to Catherine Zeta-Jones. For weeks, his name trended not as a survivor but as a cautionary tale, his reputation bruised by the very honesty that had once made him admirable. In the court of public opinion, he wasn't a brave man confronting death, he was the butt of an international joke. Michael later clarified that his words had been misinterpreted, that he hadn't meant to reduce such a serious illness to a scandalous soundbite. But the damage was done. For an actor whose career was built on power and control, it was a devastating blow to be portrayed as reckless and careless in such a vulnerable moment. Privately, the controversy compounded the strain on his marriage. Catherine Zeta-Jones, already struggling with her own battles with bipolar disorder, found herself thrust into a media circus she never asked for. The couple, once hailed as one of Hollywood's most glamorous pairings, suddenly appeared fragile and fractured under the harsh light of public scrutiny. What should have been a triumphant chapter in Michael's story, the victory over a life-threatening disease, became yet another example of how fame twisted the narrative. Even when he fought for his life, the world demanded scandal over sympathy. And the fallout from this period would ripple into the most painful chapter of all, the collapse of his family life as his son Cameron descended into addiction and prison. If Michael Douglas's battle with cancer tested his body, his struggle with his eldest son Cameron tested his very soul. For decades, Cameron's life played out like a tragic mirror of his father's darkest flaws, only magnified to extremes. While Michael fought to balance fame, addiction, and family, Cameron seemed to drown in the very temptations that Michael had barely escaped. Born in 1978 to Michael and his first wife, Deandra Luker, Cameron grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege, yet also by chaos. His parents' marriage was turbulent, and by the time he was a teenager, he was already slipping into drugs. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, his spiral was relentless. Michael, consumed by his own career and personal demons, admitted later that he hadn't always been there when his son needed him most. By the early 2000s, Cameron's addiction had escalated into full-blown criminal behavior. He was arrested multiple times for possession and drug trafficking, culminating in a 2009 conviction that sentenced him to 5 years in prison. For Michael, it was a devastating blow not just because his son was behind bars, but because he carried the unbearable weight of guilt. To the public, Michael was Gordon Gekko, the symbol of greed and excess. Now, they saw him as a father who had failed his own child. The scandal exploded in the press. Tabloids reveled in Cameron's downfall, painting lurid stories of the Douglas dynasty cursed by addiction and excess. For Michael, every headline cut deep. He confessed in interviews that the pain of watching his son waste away in a prison cell was far worse than any cancer diagnosis. "My career, my health, even my marriage, I could fight those battles," he once said. But nothing compares to the helplessness of watching your child self-destruct. Cameron's time in prison was brutal. He spent nearly 7 years behind bars, including solitary confinement, his health deteriorating under the weight of withdrawal and despair. Michael visited when he could, their conversations heavy with regret, anger, and fragile hope. It was in those prison visits that Michael confronted not only his son's brokenness but also his own failures as a father. The tragedy of Cameron became more than just a personal heartbreak. It was a public reckoning. The world judged Michael harshly, branding him a man who could conquer Hollywood but not his own household. And for a star whose identity had always been wrapped in power and control, this was the most painful humiliation of all. But the storm didn't end there. As Michael grappled with his son's incarceration, the pressure fractured even the foundation of what had seemed like his most stable relationship, his marriage to Catherine Zeta-Jones. As Cameron's life unraveled under the glare of courtroom lights and prison bars, Michael Douglas found himself dragged into the story not as a Hollywood icon, but as a father on trial in the court of public opinion. For decades, he had been celebrated for his roles as powerful, commanding men, but now the headlines painted a far harsher portrait. Michael Douglas, the failed father. It was a judgment that cut deeper than any review or scandal he had faced before. Commentators pointed to his own battles with addiction, his years of chasing fame, and the fractured nature of his first marriage. They said Cameron's downfall was the inevitable consequence of Michael's choices, that he had been too consumed by career and indulgence to notice his son's pain. The narrative was brutal and relentless, reducing a lifetime of complexity to a single damning verdict. He had failed at the most important role of all. Michael did little to hide his anguish. In interviews, his composure cracked. He admitted feeling overwhelming guilt, confessing that his success in Hollywood had come at a terrible personal cost. He spoke of how he wished he had been more present, more attentive, more of a guiding hand instead of a distant figure chasing cameras and acclaim. As a father, you can't help but feel responsible, he once said. When your child suffers, you carry that suffering with you. The criticism weighed heavily not only on his reputation but on his spirit. Hollywood was a place where flaws could be repackaged as mystique, but fatherhood had no such luxury. Every article about Cameron became a mirror, forcing Michael to confront his own failings. And while he had faced addiction, illness, and scandal before, nothing shook his sense of identity like this public dissection of his role as a parent. The man who had once stood so confidently as Gordon Gekko or Dan Gallagher now seemed diminished, not by age or illness, but by the quiet shame of knowing that the world saw his son's tragedy as his own undoing. It was a burden that seeped into every part of his life, leaving cracks in places that had once seemed unbreakable, including his marriage to Catherine Zeta-Jones, which was already straining under the weight of illness, fame, and relentless scrutiny. For years, Michael Douglas and Catherine Zeta-Jones were seen as one of Hollywood's most glamorous couples, a union of old-school stardom and modern elegance. Their marriage, often spotlighted on red carpets and glossy magazine covers, seemed unshakable. But behind the polished veneer, cracks had been forming, and by the early 2010s, the weight of illness, scandal, and personal turmoil began to take its toll. Michael's throat cancer diagnosis had already shaken the foundation of their relationship. Catherine stood by him during his treatment, but the emotional cost was immense. Watching her husband wither under chemotherapy while dealing with her own struggles with bipolar disorder pushed her to the edge. What the public saw as devotion was, in private, a grueling test of endurance that left them both exhausted and frayed. Then came the HPV scandal, which cast an even darker shadow. Michael's candid admission about the possible cause of his cancer embarrassed Catherine, dragging her unwillingly into a storm of speculation and innuendo. Overnight, their private life became fodder for tabloids, and Catherine, who had always protected her image with care, felt betrayed by a truth that the world twisted into mockery. At the same time, the ordeal with Cameron loomed over their household. The endless headlines about Michael's son, the public shaming of his fatherhood, and the weight of visiting prisons, all of it strained Catherine's patience and her emotional reserves. It wasn't just Michael's battle anymore, it was hers too, and the load was proving unbearable. By 2013, the tension became undeniable. The couple quietly announced they were separating, shocking fans who had once believed in their fairy tale romance. For Michael, it was another public humiliation. His health had nearly killed him. His son was in prison, and now the love of his life was slipping away. The man who had once embodied control and dominance on screen found his personal life reduced to a fragile mess he could no longer manage. The separation was painful, but it wasn't final. Both Michael and Catherine, despite their distance, admitted there was still love between them. It was as if the chaos of fame and tragedy had torn them apart, but the bond they shared was not entirely broken. They were two people bruised, battered, and scarred, but not yet defeated. Still, for Michael, the period marked a brutal reckoning. He was no longer the untouchable Hollywood star. He was a man whose health, family, and marriage had all nearly collapsed at once. And though reconciliation would come later, the scars from this unraveling remained etched into his story, a reminder that even the brightest love can wither under the unforgiving weight of fame and misfortune. When Michael Douglas and Catherine Zeta-Jones announced their separation in 2013, the news reverberated through Hollywood like a shockwave. To the public, they had been the picture of elegance and stability, proof that even in a town where marriages burned out like flashbulbs, true love could endure. Their split shattered that illusion and exposed the raw truth. Even the most dazzling partnerships are vulnerable when tested by relentless pressure. During their time apart, both Michael and Catherine retreated into their private struggles. For Michael, the aftermath of cancer treatment left him physically weakened and emotionally drained. He admitted to bouts of depression, the lingering fear of relapse, and the gnawing guilt over Cameron's imprisonment. Without Catherine at his side, he faced a void he had never truly felt before, an emptiness that fame and fortune could not fill. Catherine, on the other hand, was grappling with her own storm. Her battle with bipolar disorder had been made public years earlier, but during the separation, the weight of media scrutiny became unbearable. Every move she made was dissected, every rumor magnified, as if her illness were a spectacle for entertainment. She checked into treatment again, not out of weakness, but out of sheer determination to reclaim stability in a world determined to exploit her vulnerability. Despite the distance, the bond between them never fully broke. Friends close to the couple revealed that even while apart, they maintained contact, speaking about their children, sharing quiet words of comfort, and leaving doors open for reconciliation. Michael often said that the separation, painful as it was, forced him to reflect on what truly mattered. "You learn quickly," he admitted, "that without love, without family, the rest of it means nothing." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. By 2014, rumors circulated that the two were spending time together again. Paparazzi captured them attending family events, walking hand in hand, their connection seemingly rekindled. Unlike the glamorous spectacle of their early years, this was a quieter reunion, forged not in the glow of red carpets, but in the quiet resilience of survival. When they officially reconciled, it wasn't presented as a fairy tale ending, but as a hard-won second chance. Both had been to the edge, Michael with illness and scandal, Catherine with her mental health battles, and somehow they had found their way back. Their marriage became less about appearances and more about endurance, a testament to the fact that even in Hollywood, love could weather storms if both hearts were willing to fight. Still, the years of separation left marks that would never fully fade. Michael and Catherine had rebuilt their life together, but always with the knowledge of how fragile it had once been. For Michael, it was yet another lesson that fame could gild a relationship in gold on the outside, but only truth and resilience could keep it alive on the inside. As Michael Douglas moved deeper into his 70s, the question of legacy began to loom larger than ever. He had survived cancer, navigated scandal, endured the pain of watching his son imprisoned, and fought to keep his marriage alive. Every triumph carried scars, and every scar told a story. For a man born into Hollywood royalty, the idea of what he would leave behind was no longer measured only in Oscars or box office numbers, but in the hard-won lessons of survival. Professionally, Michael remained active, taking on roles that reflected his maturity rather than resisting it. Performances in films like Behind the Candelabra and series like The Kaminsky Method showed a man unafraid to embrace age, vulnerability, and even humor about his own mortality. These roles resonated not just because of his talent, but because audiences sensed the truth behind them. Michael wasn't simply acting, he was channeling decades of lived experience, each line drawn from wounds that had finally found healing. Privately, he became more reflective, often speaking about the cost of fame with a candor that felt almost confessional. He acknowledged the mistakes that had fractured his family, the addictions that had nearly consumed him, and the times when ambition blinded him to the people who needed him most. Yet, he also embraced gratitude for Catherine's return, for Cameron's eventual recovery after prison, and for the chance to live long enough to mend relationships that once seemed beyond repair. In interviews, Michael often drew comparisons between himself and his father. Kirk Douglas had lived past 100, carrying his own complex legacy of brilliance and brutality. Michael admitted that much of his life had been spent running from his father's shadow, only to realize later that legacy isn't about escaping, it's about transforming. You don't erase the past, he once reflected. You learn how to carry it, so it doesn't crush you. The older he became, the more he spoke about authenticity. For a man who had played so many masks, Gordon Gekko, Dan Gallagher, Nick Curran, the idea of stripping them away was both terrifying and liberating. What mattered now wasn't maintaining an image, but leaving behind a truth. Fame had given him everything and taken just as much. But survival had taught him something fame never could. That the real measure of a life is not how brightly you shine, but how you endure when the lights go dark. And yet, even in reflection, Michael never escaped the paradox. To the public, he would always be the charming rogue, the dangerous man, the Hollywood heir who both thrived and suffered under the name Douglas. But to himself, he was simply a man who had tried, failed, fallen, and stood back up again and again. In the twilight of his career, Michael Douglas began to speak with a raw honesty that only comes from decades of survival. Gone were the carefully measured words of a star trying to protect his image. Instead, he spoke openly about the contradictions of his life, the glamour and the darkness, the triumphs and the humiliations, the salvation and the curse of fame. For Michael, fame had been a double-edged sword. On one side, it had given him everything: recognition, wealth, and the kind of roles that most actors could only dream of. It had allowed him to stand shoulder to shoulder with the greatest talents of his era, to collect Oscars, and to etch his name into Hollywood history. On the other side, it had magnified every flaw, every mistake, every private wound into a headline. Fame had turned his son's addiction into a public trial, his illness into late-night comedy fodder, and his marriage into gossip fuel. "You think it will save you?" he once admitted. "But if you don't know who you are, it will destroy you." What made his reflections striking was not bitterness, but acceptance. Michael had reached a point where he no longer tried to rewrite the narrative or escape the shadows of his past. He acknowledged the pain as part of the story, the cancer, the scandals, the separation, the judgment. They were not detours but essential chapters in the book of his life. Survival wasn't about pretending those things hadn't happened. It was about carrying them without letting them crush him. He often spoke about the difference between legacy and illusion. Legacy, he said, is what remains when the applause fades. Illusion is what the applause was built on. Too many in Hollywood confuse the two, chasing the glitter long after the gold has tarnished. Michael's hard-earned wisdom was that legacy comes not from perfection but from resilience, from the willingness to stand up again, no matter how public the fall. In those reflections, Michael Douglas offered something rare, a testimony from a man who had lived through the full cycle of Hollywood, born into its royalty, seduced by its power, destroyed by its excess, and redeemed not by fame itself, but by the courage to face life without the mask. His story was not about being untouched by tragedy, but about finding truth inside it. As Michael Douglas looks back across the decades, the applause that once thundered for him has grown quieter, but the meaning of his journey has grown louder. He no longer measures himself by the size of the box office or the weight of his awards shelf. Instead, he measures his life by survival, by the fact that after addiction, scandal, disease, heartbreak, and shame, he is still standing. He often speaks now with the gravity of someone who has lived multiple lives in one body, the eager son fighting to escape his father's shadow, the ambitious producer who gambled everything on a story no one believed in, the dangerous leading man who embodied the darkest desires of an era, the broken father visiting his son behind bars, the gaunt survivor whispering through cancer treatments, and the husband fighting to save a love nearly destroyed by fame's cruelty. Each version of Michael Douglas still exists within him, layered and scarred, but together they form something real, something far more valuable than image, truth. His message in these later years is not one of triumphalism, but of warning. Fame, he says, isn't salvation. It's a mask, and if you don't learn how to live without it, that mask will suffocate you. Those words, coming from a man who has lived both the fantasy and the nightmare of celebrity, carry the weight of authenticity. They are not rehearsed lines for a role, but lessons carved from pain. Yet, for all the darkness, Michael also carries gratitude. Gratitude for Catherine, who returned when the world thought their marriage was finished. Gratitude for Cameron, who, after years in prison, is trying to rebuild his life. Gratitude for the chance to see his own father live to 103, and to understand that survival itself can be a legacy. Gratitude, even, for the tragedies, because without them, he admits, he might never have discovered what it means to live honestly. Today, Michael Douglas no longer chases the spotlight, but neither does he run from it. He has learned that legacy is not about the applause at your peak, but about the silence afterward, and what remains when the lights finally go out. For him, that legacy is complicated, imperfect, but deeply human. It is the story of a man who carried the weight of greatness and scandal, stumbled often, but refused to let the fall define the ending. And perhaps that is his final gift to us, the reminder that behind every glittering Hollywood facade is a fragile human being, and that sometimes the most powerful story is not how brightly someone shone, but how bravely they endured when the spotlight faded.